So one of the things I encountered, and I logged these on the repo. There's a few different bugs open. I actually turn that. Um, so one of the bugs that I realized looking at and digging up code, I forgot when I set this up on Friday, I forgot to filter down the votes by username. So we're actually seeing everybody's games basically, or everybody's items, rather than just my own. So that's a pretty easy fix. If I pull up the code and look at here, basically in these cases, I just need to add an additional where clause to what I forgot to do. So in my votes, my up votes, my down votes, all three of those, I need to remember to add where equal to and check the username. Does that make sense? Kind of understand why we need to do that. Otherwise, we're seeing everybody's data or everybody's library and not just my own. That was harder to see because I really only had like one user in there. But I need to go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to just add that here. Actually, I'm going to push that down and that over. So collection movie vote, I need to filter it by that. And same thing here. Same thing here. So you'll notice that both the my upvotes and my downvotes case actually need two where clauses. So both they get like by the username, but also the ones that are positive or the ones that are negative. Cool. So just a quick thing I wanted to make sure that I noted on there because I forgot to put that one line in for those. Okay. So because obviously I don't want you to have that same bug in your applications. So that's one thing to knock down. Another thing that I didn't get to is when we were populating that spinner, right? So we populated it with all movies, my votes, my upvotes, my downvotes. I almost got to the point where I extracted the string, and remember, part of why I added the spinner option was so that I could extract the strings. We didn't get there, so I got it here, but then I didn't actually do the string extraction. So that's one thing we want to fix. Good news is that's an easy fix. So in terms of going to the, see, go to main activity. So you'll see here I've kind of got those strings hard-coded. Sometimes it will warn you in the Android Studio when you've got hard-coded strings that you need to extract them. Some cases it won't. So if I see here it's not alerting me. So I just kind of have to be diligent with those things. So this is pretty simple. I'm just going to do Alt-Enter here, extract the string resources, and just give it a name. So I might say just all movies, or I could say all movies option. I'm going to call it all movies. I'm going to call this one my votes. Let's enter my upvotes, my downvotes. So just a little detail there that you'll want to make sure that you fix in your projects as well. Does that make sense so far? Just two quick fixes, just to note that I forgot those. So filtering by username when I extract those strings. And then there was one other thing that I needed to talk about, which is a larger one of the three, larger bug of the three. But I mentioned at some point that we would need to do it, and I never really got back to doing it. So I mentioned that when we call set adapter on the spinner, remember that resets your selection to the first index. So everybody kind of remember hearing that. And I mentioned that oftentimes that means we need to do some additional work to preserve that. That makes sense. So let's try to run the app in its current state, and maybe I can show you what the current behavior is. And we can think about how we're going to fix that. So it's up and running. Oh, it's still starting. While it's starting, I'm going to go ahead and grab get into the console, Firebase console, and go to the movie list, go to my database. All right, so I've got the genres collection up here. There it starts. Okay, so right now, let's say I filtered down to just comedy, right? So you can see that that's working so far, right? Everybody good? Okay, so I would expect if I make a change over here that it doesn't change what the user has in the dropdown, right? If they're filtered by comedy, they should still stay filtered by comedy. All clear? Now, because of the real-timeliness behavior here, let me add a new document and say this is example. And name example. Okay, so I would expect the user selection doesn't change. Okay, but notice immediately when I did that, they lost their selection down to comedy. Everybody see that? That's really undesirable. Okay, that's sometimes you have to watch out for things like this with the real-time behavior, because we say, hey, we changed something immediately, we want it to reflect, which is a good thing, but it also can be dangerous in cases like this. Okay, so what I want to do is if I add a genre like this, it shouldn't change the user's selection. Okay. Now, how can I prevent that? Right? How can we prevent that? Where I would start by doing is stepping back and trying to diagnose why is it occurring in the first place. So why is the user's selection of genre being changed based on my change here? How is that happening? Thinking about the code. Where does that process start? So I make a change here. What happens first? Yes.
Most users we have like all genres as like the default, and then
okay. Which is kind of true, but I'm asking where in the code does this process start? Okay. Right. Or even before that. It is related to the observer, but it's even before that, right? So anytime I make a change to the database, remember that when we step back to the view model, that we had told it, where is it? I need to go up to the constructor. Okay. So this bit of code here, right? I had told it that I want to get the genres and I want to be told about any updates to that genres list, right? Because I registered a snapshot listener. Snapshot listener gets triggered both at the beginning and whenever there's a change. Does that make sense? So because I'm registering the snapshot listener, this gets triggered again when there's an update. Okay. If I hadn't registered a snapshot listener here, if I just asked for a one-time request, then this wouldn't be occurring. Does that make sense? So it wouldn't be occurring if this wasn't a snapshot listener. And remember, I showed you that there's two different ways to read data. We can either read it once, or we can read in and observe it using these snapshot listeners. Cool? So that's one way we could solve this. We could step back and say, hey, maybe for us, Maybe we don't want this real timey. Maybe we just want to get it once and then forget about it. Okay? Does that make sense? So we could fix it that way. But there's some benefits, right, that we get by having this real-timey behavior. Especially one of those that's really helpful to us is it works better with offline mode, right? Because remember, if I set it up this way, it can immediately go to the offline cache of the genres, use that, and give us that until we have the online one, and then it brings it back in, right? So in fact, this happens not necessarily only when I change the data. If I were to be offline and then come back online, that potentially could push down a new list of genres. Does that make sense? Which we kind of want, right? We do want that behavior, but it means that this bug can happen even if the data is not changing. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but that's where we want to start is looking at what's causing this, right? So the first thing is that. Okay. So this happens. So let's say we want to stick with that real-time behavior. Okay. If it does go through successfully, we get down into the second part. We get down into this. And we say, okay, let's get all the genres that you sent me back. Let's turn them into a list of genres, and then we'll call post value, put in the new genres. Cool. So that's so far so good. And then what you were saying about the observer, right? Remember, we're observing it over here, right? So we use the snapshot listener to get the update. That then pushes the update to the live data, which then we're dealing with here. Does that make sense? Now, one question to ask. In terms of fixing this, can we fix it in the view model? Or do we have to fix it in the activity? Yeah.
We can't fix them in the view model.
Why not? Why can't I fix this in the view model?
Because in the view model, all you're doing is sending the data back.
Yep.
Post value. You're
Yep.
not, if you were to try and manipulate that, you're not sending it all. So.
Right. Or rather, who had one way I would look at it is who has access to the spinner, right? Who has a reference to the spinner? Well, its main activity, the view model doesn't. And remember that the view model never should have a reference to the views, ever, period. That's part of the point of the separation, right? Is because we don't want these view models to directly be affecting the views. So that means anything that affects the views has to happen in the activity and not the view model, right? Okay. Why is that important? Well, because the part that's kind of causing the bug is this call to set adapter, spinner.setAdapter, right? So wherever that is where we have to fix the problem. Does that make sense? Right? Wherever that reference to the spinner is where we have to resolve it. Okay. And so what do? Well, effectively what we need to do is after we set the adapter, we need to go back in and set, say, genre spinner dot set I think it's set selection. Yeah. So set selection, and we'd set it to, say, position 0, right, or whatever, right? So position 0 would be going back to selecting the first option, right? So effectively down here, we need to call set selection and set it to the index of the thing that should be selected. Does that make sense? Right? Now, I don't want to set it to 0 because that's already the behavior we have. We want to set it back to what the user had previously selected before we replace the adapter. Does that make sense? So, does anybody see a solution at this point? You kind of understand the why, the where, how we got here. What do we need to do now? How do I figure out what index to set it to? Danny?
What happens if you don't include
You said what?
what happens if you don't include set selection?
It's always going to set it to 0. If I don't include line 94, it will always do that when I call set it after. Yeah.
So we just go to the gun genre spinner on set on item selected listener,
Okay.
where we know what item is selected.
Okay.
We save that to a class
So-
level and instance.
So wait a second. Save what?
The position that is selected.
Okay. So you're going to save the position that's selected.
It's in scope there. And
Okay.
only there.
So you're going to save it to main activity.
Some instance state.
Okay.
Some instance field that would be
Okay.
main state.
So you're going to save it to main activity, right? And then you say you want to restore it here.
I'm gonna restart in there, yeah. So,
Okay. Okay. Which that's a reasonable solution, and it's part of what I would say is the best solution to this is similar to that, but not exactly identical, right? So I do want to go through some of the caveats. Okay. Now, one thing to be aware of is in order to do that particularly, I actually don't need an instance variable. I can kind of do the same solution without the instance variable. Why? Well, because the spinner itself knows what's selected, right? So one thing I could try to do is I could say before I replace the list, I could say index or selected selection is equal to genre spinner dot get selected item position, right? So I could get it at the beginning and set it at the bottom, right? At the beginning of this observe call, I can ask what position is selected and then set it back here. Does that make sense? Right? Effectively, this is the same as doing it. There's really no difference with this between doing this and doing the approach that you'd suggested with the on-click listener. Just I don't need the on-click listener, right? I don't need the instance variable because we kind of already have it. Does that make sense? And so that's a good thing to be aware of. Is oftentimes you may not want to add additional state because you kind of already have that state, and the risk of adding that state is that then those two things become out of sync, right? Because if I have an instance variable, then that could disagree with what the spinner says the selected item is. Okay.
especially if that database is removing it.
Yeah, all sorts of things could be happening. Okay, so let's say I've got that, and I'm going to go back to running the app with this little change. And let's say I go down and I'm going to pick example. Okay, so I'm filtered by example, right? If I remove, let me go to Firebase. Let me go remove example. So I'm going to go to this document and I'm going to delete that genre. That's not good. Why did that happen? Why did the app crash? Well, because we're trying to set it to an index that's no longer valid because example was at the end of the list, right? So we're saying, hey, let's set it to index 5, but there's no longer an index 5. Does that make sense? So there's an issue there, right? There's an issue there. Let's say I try a different name. So I'm going to add another genre. And let's say, actually, before I do that, let me run the application again.
So you just deleted it in the database, right?
Yeah, I just had deleted it in the database. So I've got it back up and running. I'm going to go back to comedy, and I'm going to add one that starts with B so that it's before it. So best, maybe name best. All right, so if I save that, okay. That's interesting. Oh, because it's case sensitive.
Lowercase b.
Right, okay. So let me change this here. And notice that it went from comedy to best because I preserved the index, right? I preserved the index within the list, right? So there's two bugs that happen there if we do the index, right? The index is not guaranteed to be the same entry, right? Because the entries could be moving around. I could be adding new entries. I could be editing new entries. That can change what the user's got selected, right? So the index is not stable. The other thing that we saw was that if it's the last one in the list, then that causes it to crash. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is the other reason why I didn't want to take the other approach, is because this one's kind of easier and easier to roll back when you figure out what we need to do. Okay. So you see, I can't take this approach, right? This is the naive approach. It doesn't really work in practice. Make sense? So I can't just say, hey, we'll keep the current index that was selected. You selected 3, so we'll keep 3 selected. But 3 is not necessarily the same genre. Okay. So the question I want to ask then is what's stable, right? Because we just found the indexes are not stable. And in general, indexes are not stable. In a general case, yes.
So we can just use the name, because the name should be stable.
Okay. What if I'm changing the name? What if I change it from lowercase comedy to uppercase comedy? Is it still the same genre?
It's the same ID.
It's the same ID, right? So even the name, right, is something that's editable. So it's not necessarily stable, as I would say. But the thing that's stable is the ID, right? Does that make sense? What's stable, what the user is actually selecting, is that ID. Okay? So effectively what I need is kind of what we talked about before, is when the user picks something, I need to save the ID and not the position, and then restore it, pick the same one based on the ID. Does that make sense? So based on the ID that the user selected, I need to reselect that same one. Cool? Okay, so are we storing that ID anywhere already? If I look at my instance variables, I don't have the ID here. Does everybody see that? I don't have that in here. But what I do have is something else that's already tracking the ID. Does everybody know what it is? What's already tracking? Close, not exactly.
You're talking about the callback?
So remember that I implemented some code, right, that's already filtering the list based on the genre, right? How does it know what genre I'm filtering by? And what's doing the filtering? Is it the activity?
And the model.
It's a model, right? So if I take a look at the model, and this is kind of an easy oversight, you might see that we already have it, right? The model already knows what genre you picked. And actually, I would prefer to have that state be in the model. I would prefer that be in the model and not in the activity. One of the reasons for that is, remember, when you turn the screen sideways, you kind of lose your data, right? So when you turn your screen sideways, everything in the activity is lost, but the view model is actually preserved. Does that make sense? So if I rely on the activity, keeping the genre ID in the activity, it's not going to survive a screen rotation, but if it's in the view model, it will. Does that make sense, that distinction? So that's why I want to use this state rather than having it in the activity. but it's kind of the same story, right? So the place that this gets set is in response to the user picking something from a drop-down. It's just I'm saving it over here instead of saving it in the active. Cool? Questions? Okay. So I have one little oversight in that I never actually provided a way to get to this.
Private.
Huh?
It's private.
It's private, right? And I do want to keep it private because I want to limit how many ways you can go to change it, right? So, because I only want you to change that variable through this function, right? So that's kind of our setter, right? Is we say filter movies by genre is our setter for that variable. It's the way we manipulate that variable. But I need a way to expose it, so I need a getter. Okay, so I'm going to go up here somewhere. Doesn't really matter particularly where, but I'm going to add it with my other getters. And I'm going to say public string get filter genre ID. And this is going to return filter genre ID. All right, so I just need a getter there that I hadn't added previously. But that part's pretty simple. Okay, so that way we have a way to read that variable. You might notice that I didn't wrap that in a live data. We could if we wanted to. It turns out here it really doesn't matter whether you wrap it in a live data or not because it's not really something we're observing. But if we wanted to observe it, we could. So it just might create some more problems with trying to restore it. So I'm not gonna try and observe it. Okay. So back down here, so what I can do is rather than pulling out the user's selected as that selection, I'm going to make my default assumption is that the first thing is selected. Right? So my default assumption is that the first thing is selected. Okay. That means that by default they're going to go back to all genres. Right? Part of the reason that I need to start there is because what happens if the genre that they're filtering by goes away, right? If that one goes away, really the best thing we can do is go back to all, right? We don't really have a good way to preserve their thing in that case. Okay. The next thing I want to do is find out what is currently selected. So string selected, maybe selected ID is equal to model dot get filter genre ID. So we'll get that value from the model. And then basically what I need to do is just in terms of what we have in here. See, remember we're looping already through the genres. I can just say, okay, well, if that's the genre I need, let's go ahead and save it. So if genre, actually I need to do object.equals. If object.equals genre.id and selected ID, and maybe I should call this selected position, maybe for clarity. So selected position is 0 and selected ID. So selected position at this point is the position where we're at in the list. Right? So at that point I just want to say, hey, let's save the selected position that the user has. Save this index as the thing that's now selected. How would I normally do this? Well, normally I would just take the index where we're at in the loop, because you see we're in a for loop, and save that index. Does that make sense? I don't have an index right now. Why is that? Notice what kind of loop I'm using.
For each.
For each, right? I'm using a for each loop, so I don't have the index. Okay. There are some hacks. There are some ways to add that in to make that work. But oftentimes when I get to something like this, it just makes sense to go back to a regular form. So that's what I'm going to do, right? Is I'm going to revert this to a regular for loop so that I have that index. So back up here, for int I started at 0, I goes up to the what we're reiterating through genres. So genres dot size plus I. Okay. So that much is a pretty easy conversion. Obviously, make sure that you're going off of genres, which is the list of genres rather than genre names, because genre names at this point will always be size 1. Cool? Okay. You'll notice inside of there, I have some references to this genre variable. Doesn't exist anymore. So I just need to add that back in. So I'm going to say genre, and that equals genres dot get, and so I just need to get the ith element. Okay, so that's going to switch it over to being a regular for loop. And so this is one thing to remember. Anytime you need to switch that loop over from for each, you're going to need to add this additional variable. Does that make sense? And in fact, I usually do this anyway, even if I'm just starting with a regular for, because A, it makes it easier for me to change my mind and switch it over to for each, and B, it actually just makes the code cleaner rather than repeating genres.get I. And it also can turn out that genres.get I is not a free operation, so I want to make sure that only happens once, and that does all that. Okay, so with that switch, we're back in the position where I can just say, okay, we save that I, right? So basically, I'm just looping through, and equating those things. Now, why is, there's a red underline on equals. Oh, because it's objects equals, not object, it's objects equals. Okay. And I need to do an Alt-Enter to bring that in. That's why I was missing an S. So I really just go through, I loop through the genres one by one. Once we find a genre with the same ID, we know that's the one the user wants to select. We save it, and then we proceed on to the end and do that here. So all I'm doing is kind of merging two loops together, right? I'm kind of merging the conversion, the map, where I convert it from a list of genres to a list of options, as well as the place where I'm kind of searching for something that's has the same ID. Does that make sense? It's kind of two loops happening at once. Questions? Does that make sense in terms of preserving it? Again, the benefit here is rather than going by assuming that the index is the same, which it may or may not be, I go off the assumption that the ID should stay the same, right? So the position might change, but the ID won't. Okay. Gotcha being here, if that particular genre has been removed, right? If that genre has been removed, there's nothing with that ID anymore. Remember that if statement will never be true, right? And if that if statement's never true, what's the value of selected position? Default, which is 0. So that way I've safely resolved the question of like, well, what happens if I remove the last one? What happens if I just generally remove, if I remove something that's in there. So I should be able to go back. Let's say I pick comedy. Back to the website. I can do the same kind of trick. Switch this to a lowercase. You can see it's jumped to the bottom of the list, but we're still, oh, I jumped out of it. Boop. Oh, that's interesting. Did I not run my code? comedy. Where did I screw up? Clearly I've got something wrong.
So can you set breakpoints?
I can. Let's see.
Okay, let's start over here.
I can.
How does that
So,
work with live data though?
nothing special. So one thing to know about setting breakpoints in Android Studio. Android Studio is a little bit weird. A lot of IDEs that you might be used to, breakpoints just automatically work. You just have to put a breakpoint in. Android Studio kind of borrows something from Visual Studio back in the day. So Visual Studio has this behavior where, depending on how you start the application, the debugger is either attached or not attached. The reason that exists is because the program, your app, runs slower if the debugger is attached. The debugger being attached means it slows it down significantly. So oftentimes you may not want to go with that debugger attached because of the slowdown. Also because it slows it down to such a point where you can sometimes not see bugs that your users will actually see because of how it affects the speed. Does that make sense? So something where it might not crash with the debugger attached, it may crash with the debugger not attached. So that's a little thing to be wary of. Okay, we call those Heisenbugs, right? A Heisenbug is anything where it doesn't break when you have the debugger attached, or it does break when the debugger is attached. Or sorry, backwards, right? Where the behavior. Yeah, it changes when you look at it, kind of idea. So we have to be aware of that. So up on the run, there's actually two buttons. Let me stop the app. So you'll see that there's kind of two different buttons here. So there's a run button, which I've been using. There's also a debug button. Okay, so my breakpoints will only work if I click debug. They will not work if I hit run. Okay, so if I start the app with debug, it should stop at this breakpoint. If it's going to run. There it goes. Okay, so it says waiting for debugger, and you already see it's quite a bit slower with that debugger attached. But now it's stopped at my breakpoint. Everybody see that? Okay. Let me show you the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and hit run. And you see that it didn't stop at that breakpoint. Everybody see that? So run doesn't stop at the breakpoints. Debug does stop at the breakpoint. Okay. Now, oftentimes one thing that you may want to do, because that's so slow, as well as because maybe you realize later that you need the debugger, you actually can attach the debugger at a later point in time, right? So I can actually attach the debugger after it's running, okay? The way I do that is by clicking here and saying attach debugger to Android process, right? So if I click debug, it's going to start a brand new instance. I'm going to start back from the start. But if I say attach, it's going to attach to the already running instance. Okay, so I've already got it running. I can go and attach it now. It'll ask me how to do that. So you can do this either way. You can either start it normally and then attach, or you can start it with the debug. The point is you have to have the debugger attached in order for it to actually hit the breakpoints. Cool? Okay. So things I want to check. Another place I might want to have a breakpoint is down when we select it. So I might say here in the on item selected event, I'm going to put a breakpoint there as well. The reason is I want to see what's happening if I pick, say, comedy. Okay. So if I pick comedy, I can see down here what is the selected option. I can see the text in that is comedy, and the value is comedy with a lowercase c. Does that make sense? So I can see that that's the value that I would expect it to be. All good, right? Okay, so I can keep going. I need to hit over here on the debug window. I need to hit resume program to get it back up and running. Okay, so now it's not, there's no thing attached. Okay, so right now we're filtered down to comedy. That's the thing that's selected. And if I go back to the database and start making changes, let's see what happens. Update. I should hit a breakpoint. Okay. And so notice I have my breakpoint here on selected ID. What is currently the value of selected ID? You see it in this list of variables? I see selected position, but I don't see selected ID. So one thing to remember, and this is the same for every language, when you're putting a breakpoint, it stops before that line and not after that line. It's always before the line and not after the line, because the whole point is to stop before that thing happens. Okay? So it's stopped before I know what the selected ID is, not after that line is executed. So if I really want to know what that value is, I need the breakpoint to be down here on the line after, not really on that line itself. Okay, so I'm going to go there and continue on down. Okay, so I see selected ID is comedy. So that's working like I expected so far, right? I've got comedy as still the selected value, the selected ID. Very good with that? Now, let's step through and see if we can figure out what's going on here. I'm going to add some additional breakpoints down at the bottom and in the loop itself. All right, so I'm going to step over and see what's going on here. So my step over button is down here, which is F8. Step over, step over. And I'll keep going. I can see that selected ID and selected position, those are still haven't changed. Okay, here we got it's being updated. So here we have the genre comedy with an ID of comedy. Okay, and so this is in I is 1. Okay, so let's keep stepping. Step over, step over, step over. I'm going to go ahead and hit run to get to the end of this. So selected position is 1. And that's what we're going to be setting it to. Is selected position is 1. And that's kind of interesting. So it doesn't seem like it actually set it to 1. Almost. Am I calling the wrong position, the wrong function? I wonder. So maybe I'm calling the wrong function. Set sources for 32. I need to switch over to 30, so I can see the code. 30, 30, sync changes. I'm just trying to see if I'm calling the right function. And there's, of course, no comment on said function. I wonder, it looks like there might be a bug here. So you can see in the interface that there are two functions. Does everybody see that? Set selection and set selection. One takes a Boolean and the other one doesn't. Does everybody see that? This is on the ABS spinner, which is a parent class of spinner. It actually looks like they're doing two different things. So this one's calling set selection int, and this is calling set next selected position int. I don't think those are doing the same thing. So to just verify that that is the case, I'm going to call pass false as that second argument.
So is set selection int a public method?
I don't believe so.
Okay,
I don't believe so.
Okay.
And min compile SCK specified independency. Oh, okay. So I do have to target 31. So I do have to unchain. I have to undo that change to Gradle that I just made. That's a pretty big deal because that would be a bug in Android. So I'm filtered down to comedy. I need to make sure my debugger is attached because I didn't attach it that time. And I want to go back here. Update. Oh, and I hit the wrong button. So one thing I've been used to. I used Visual Studio for a very long time. The button to continue when you're at a breakpoint in Visual Studio is that button up here versus that button in Android Studio causes it to start over. So I always have this problem because I want to do it the way that I'm used to doing it in Visual Studio, and it didn't work for me. So maybe I just try this without the debugger attached. And still, same dealio. So it almost seems as if there's something interesting happening with what's internal to Android, because that is very odd. And I might have to investigate that further. Because that to me seems like, so I selected something and then it actually selected something different than what I told it to select, right? I could check this. Maybe if I do, let's just say we always set it to 1. And I was not prepared for this at all today because I have done this way in the past and it's always worked for me. So let's see. If I go to here, back to comedy, as I've been doing, told it to go to 1. Okay. Which it did. Okay. I wonder if there's a timing issue here. Interesting. So let me try 2. Same story. And the only thing I want to change so right now I've got the third thing selected, which is true. And if I were to go here, name best, that should stay at index 2, which it does. So if I say best, or sorry, cancel, edit that, name goes to best, update. Okay. So that behaved the way I had expected it to. What? Yeah, I'm not.
I'm trying to figure this out too. I can't figure it out.
Because it's selecting the index. It is selecting. I was like, well, maybe it's selecting the wrong index. Maybe it's selecting a different index than what I told it to. But if I set it hard-coded always as a certain index, oh, I know what it is. I know what it is. Okay. I know what it is. I missed it. Okay. So it's line 94. It's line 94 needs to change. Because I'm off by 1. Line 94 needs to be I plus 1. Why? So remember, selected position is the index in the dropdown. What is I? I is the index in the genres. There is one more item in the dropdown than in the list of genres. So the first genre, which is index 0 in that array, is index 1 in the other array.
Oh, so they both start at 0, right?
No, well, index 0 in this genre names array is all genres.
Which doesn't exist in the database.
Which doesn't exist in the database. That's the discrepancy. That's my whole problem. Is so I need to be saying I plus 1 instead of just I. That's what's going on. That's what's going on. So that should fix it, hopefully.
When you make changes in the code while you're debugging, will it run that change or not?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't believe so. I believe it's still running the old code. So back to comedy. Move something before it. Yay. Move something after it. Yay. Okay. So that's the whole dealio is I just need to do I plus 1 because I forgot to account for the all of these is not in this list, but is in the list. Cool. That took a little bit more debugging than I thought it would, but you can kind of see that the solution is relatively simple. Does that make sense? relatively simple. But you can see why I wanted to do this differently, why I wanted to go off the ID rather than going off of the position. Does that make sense? You at least get that part, because that's the common mistake is people assume, okay, IDs or positions are stable, whether it be in the recycler view it's stable or whether it's in the spinner it's stable. Wherever you're displaying a list, you can't ever assume that the order of things is stable. Cool. Merging part. All right. That's the 3 bugs that I wanted to go over and talk about. So remember, what we talked about was first, how do I want to make sure I filter the votes by the username. I went and extracted the options, and then we looked at how to do this. So that removes that fix me. Did I? Oh, yep, I did not remove the fix me here. And also over in the view model, did I remove the fix me? Yes, I did. Okay. So that's it. In terms of what? In terms of setting up the...
No, just figuring out what was going on there.
Yeah. Because unfortunately you don't get a lot of, even looking through this debugger, you can see it's kind of hard because you don't necessarily get a lot of feedback when we're talking about this particular thing. Right? And the only way I knew that something was wrong is because I remembered, that I was able to figure out because I remembered, what was going on. All right. That's that.